Huge earthquake going on. The tower is collapsing.
The earth shook on a February morning in 2001. It was a nerve-wracking reminder of the constant threat beneath us.
Still going?
Yeah.
But small in comparison to the massive quake expected to hit the Pacific Northwest. One that would be stronger than the catastrophic earthquake and tsunami, which killed thousands in Japan.
The chances are that you'll survive it. The challenge is surviving the aftermath.
This is a King 5 special report, Earthquake, Disaster Foretold. Here's your host, King 5 reporter, Glenn Farley.
It happened virtually below where I'm standing, 32 miles underground, out beyond where the Nisqually River flows into Puget Sound. This was the site of Washington's last major earthquake. But don't be confused, this was not the big one. And these smaller earthquakes like Nisqually are connected geologically to the big one that's coming. Because here in Washington, we live in a place where two big pieces of the Earth's crust are being compressed together in slow motion. And I will take you to places where you will see evidence of past big ones. And just like these smaller earthquakes, it's a cycle that keeps repeating itself. If silence could speak. In this coastal forest in Washington state, there is a story to tell. And this place has a name, the Ghost Forest. And the piece here today masks the violence which struck here at 9 p.m. on January 26th of the year 1700. As the geological forces which created a great earthquake and tsunami in Japan just 8 years ago reminds us that even today, that threat remains to strike us on the west coast of the U.S. again. Jeff Oxos takes us up the Copalis River, not far from where it empties into the Pacific Ocean, where the roots of those trees extend on land that is being pushed higher by tectonic force. So what killed the Ghost Forest? It's very simple, a loss of elevation. So for hundreds of years, these trees were growing in largely a freshwater environment, but they weren't very high above sea level. So in the earthquake, the west coast of Washington state dropped more than 6 feet. This became a salt marsh, and the trees died. From the Copalis River on Washington's west coast to Discovery Bay on the state's north coast, where geography captures wave energy. Geologists can track the history of great earthquakes and tsunamis. Chopping away at a mud bank, Carrie Garrison-Laney exposes the signatures from the past.
This is an event. This is an unusual event.
She's a geologist with Washington Sea Grant, working with the University of Washington.
And there's another sand layer comparable in size to the one above it.
What is gray is what stands out.
Here, there's definitely organic material, but there's also a lot of mud and silt.
Sand pushed in by large waves, covered up by more mud.
This one has a radiocarbon date of about 600 years old. And this one has a radiocarbon date that suggests it's from 1700.
And it's all generated from a 600-mile-long fault running off the Pacific coast from Cape Mendocino, California, past Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, Canada. The fault runs along a boundary of crustal plates making up the ocean floor that are, for now, locked to the western edge of the North American plate. Those plates pushing against each other, driving to the northeast and up. And when they release, all hell breaks loose. The next one likely to rank as one of the world's biggest earthquakes, a magnitude 9 plus. Our earthquake history runs deep, and as Garrison-Laney goes back further in time taking core samples, You can see the pattern continue.
Marsh, big disturbance event. Normal marsh, disturbance event. Normal marsh, another disturbance event. There's actually 9 or 10 layers.
It's a record dating back nearly 2,000 years. It all promises there will be more violence to disrupt the peace, more ghost forest. A warning for all of us to prepare. Washington has 157 miles of marine shoreline considered vulnerable to tsunami. When we think of tsunamis, we used to think of the outer coast or the Strait of Juan de Fuca, but now we're learning we're also vulnerable here in Puget Sound. So what changed? Well, some of the science has changed. We've made new discoveries. We've also done more analysis on the earthquakes and the waves they generate. If you're watching this story, odds are you live on or near the Pacific Rim. And while the Pacific Ocean is vast, we are constantly reminded that we are all connected. In the wake of that Japanese earthquake and tsunami in 2011, Washington and the U.S. West Coast eventually saw much of the floating debris from that disaster deposited on our shoreline. And a quake up to a magnitude 9.2 is expected to happen here again. This map says a lot. The 5 largest earthquakes in recorded history have happened on the Pacific Rim within the last 70 years. Number 1 is the 9.5 striking Chile in 1960. Number 2, the 9.2 Alaska quake in 1964. Number 3, a 9.1 in Indonesia in 2004. Number 4, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, a 9.0. And number 5, another 9.0 off eastern Russia in 1952. Every subduction zone has experienced an earthquake in modern times except ours, the Cascadia Fault running the coast from northern California through western Canada. The fault that gave us the ghost forest hasn't shaken in 319 years. What will the next quake be like?
So you see the hypocenter, that's where the earthquake starts. So the seismic waves are radiating outwards. And these lines here are going to show you the shaking at these various cities. So these are more accurate than any of the estimates that we've done in the past for magnitude 9 earthquakes.
Erin Worth is with the U.S. Geological Survey. She's part of the M9 project, a collaboration between the USGS and the University of Washington. M9 stands for a magnitude 9 megaquake. And using supercomputers, she was part of a team running 50 scenarios, which produced dramatically different results for different cities depending on where the earthquake starts.
So you can see here Crescent City is starting to shake. Now shaking is reaching Aberdeen. Now it's starting to reach Portland. And finally reaching Seattle. And so the size of these wiggles tell you how strong the shaking is. And then you can also see that Seattle has pretty strong shaking. And the reason for that is that Seattle sits within a deep sedimentary basin. So that sedimentary basin amplifies the ground shaking, causing Seattle to shake more.
But start the earthquake from the opposite direction, the results for the region's biggest city are far less severe, even though it's closer and the waves of shaking energy don't pile up.
So in this scenario, you can see the hypocenter is now off northwest Washington. Seismic waves again are radiating outwards. Shaking is hitting Seattle and Aberdeen first. So this is actually much less.
A giant earthquake lasting around 5 minutes would be bad by itself, but remember, these types of quakes are a double whammy because they also generate huge tsunami waves.
You can see the wave propagate towards the outer coast, and it reaches the outer coast in about 15-20 minutes.
And in this computer simulation, we've learned that more inland waters, including Puget Sound, Seattle, and Tacoma, are more vulnerable than previously thought. About 5 feet in Seattle, but the waves could top 10 feet in Tacoma's Commencement Bay.
Well, I've showed it to a couple people and their reaction is, oh, and I think it hits home because at this level they can pick out where they live.
Karina Forson is the chief hazards geologist for the Washington Geological Survey, part of the Department of Natural Resources.
This is really important to visualize how tsunami waves travel through Washington because we do have such complicated waterways and this unique Puget Sound environment.
Work has already started on specific tsunami models for localized areas, even currents. This is Bellingham.
And you have huge oil tankers waiting offshore, and so you can really see some of these whirlpools and eddies develop as the wave travels over shallow areas and around peninsulas.
And while we think of tsunami waves, the water forming those waves is pulled from other areas in blue first. The deepest red, more than 10 feet. For some places on the coast, it doesn't reflect the full reality.
The inundation in some of these areas is over 60 feet.
It's all a work in progress. Earlier this year, seismologists at the University of Washington went looking for people with basements and garages to help set up instruments to analyze earthquake waves as they propagated through the ground. Ted Land explains.
At her parents' home on Mercer Island, Tessa Check is installing a sensor which picks up vibrations in the ground. The WSU Earth Sciences student is an intern at the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network. She's helping put this equipment in homes throughout Puget Sound, part of an effort to better understand an earthquake's impacts.
We need multiple locations in order to get that 3D image that we're looking for.
UW asked for volunteers willing to host this equipment in their basement or garage for a month or so.
Normally in an urban environment is a terrible place to put a seismic instrument because you want it to be seismically quiet. However, the technique we're using relies on background seismic noise, which is wind against buildings, trees, trains, traffic, and it works extraordinarily well.
Those readings coming in from multiple locations help scientists learn more about the behavior of different soils and how buildings will react to shaking. The Seattle Basin, the focus of this study, can amplify earthquakes with potentially devastating effects.
It's also like a bathtub where you throw a rock in there, the waves go out and bounce off the edges, so the duration can be much longer as well.
Once we start hitting record, then it's going to pick up everything in the area.
Within minutes, Check is already getting readings. This is how sensitive it is.
Those jagged lines right there.
Check's mom remembers what it was like to ride out the 2001 Nisqually quake in this same house.
Tessa was a baby, and my son was home, and we just, felt everything roll, I think, and then not knowing really what to do.
This is one way to get ahead of the next one.
The more we can understand it, the more we can prepare for it and be ready for when it does happen.
When a tsunami starts racing toward the Washington coast, some people will have nowhere else to go but up.
Go to the stair tower and proceed up the stairs.
Coming up next, Washington State is leading the way for vertical evacuation towers.
Open the door, get in, get Trixie in, and then I'll have to lock the door. And I'll write it out.
Some are already prepared to write it out in their tsunami capsule. We'll be right back.
If you were on the beach and learned a tsunami was coming, could you get high enough to get out of reach of the waves? Well, if there was high land, a bluff, that would be an easy decision. But what if that wasn't an option? Well, there is a building in North America that could get you high enough, and a second is on its way, both on the Washington coast.
Go to the stair tower and proceed up the stairs.
The classic school fire drill tells kids to go outside.
Put your right hand on the rail.
But why are these kids told to go inside and up? This drill is all about getting to higher ground, out of the reach of giant tsunami waves. The kinds of waves that struck Japan in their last big tsunami in 2011, which killed 15,000 people.
Well, Costa Elementary students, you're doing a fantastic job.
We're just miles away from a reminder of our last giant earthquake and tsunami in the year 1700, a quake that caused the Washington coast to drop more than 6 feet, killing trees, some of which stand nearly 320 years later as a ghost forest. We're now considered in the window for the next one. And here's the thing. This is the only tsunami evacuation structure in North America. So what was that January day like in the year 1700? Well, it didn't just affect us here in the Pacific Northwest. It affected the Pacific Rim. And in this scientific simulation of what that day may have looked like, you can see the wave propagating down past California, even touching South America. But what was really noted is what it did to coastal villages in Japan.
We're on, down by Tokeland. This is out on the peninsula here.
Shot! Just last year, geologists with the Department of Natural Resources simulated quake waves going into the ground, and they concluded the ground could support this. What will become only the second vertical evacuation structure in North America. The Acosta School, some 20 miles to the north, incorporated a strong, tall structure into a building.
Basically, you have your 4 stair towers and you have your beams that go across, which is your tsunami structure.
Complete with breakaway walls, allowing waves to flow through the first floor. The tower on the tiny Shoalwater Bay Indian Reservation will be exclusively for evacuation and hold 600 people.
Our people deserve to be safe. They deserve to have hope, and that's what we want to show them and have them feel, is that they can get to safety.
Lee Shipman is an elder and heads the tribe's emergency management agency. She's next to Tribal Police Chief Jim Bergstrom.
And if it's an earthquake and the roads are disrupted, you can't drive, you're going to have to be able to walk, and that's what the plan is here. Put this tower in place with the idea that someone can walk to it within 15 minutes.
There would have to be many vertical evacuation structures.
Bob Freitag is a professor in the College of Built Environments at the University of Washington. He studied vertical evacuation concepts for decades.
And the risk could be addressed.
He has launched a project with Washington's Emergency Management Division to figure out how many the state needs. One evacuation structure is probably all the Tokeland Peninsula needs. Folks at the base of the peninsula can reach the bluffs with roads and trails that lead to higher ground.
Here's another tower.
But the Acosta School can't cover the low Westport area all by itself. Each circle on this map is a 15-minute walk. Another 5 towers needed just between the school and the end of that peninsula. He has a book full of concepts.
And here's just an example. Here's a resort or a hotel or a parking lot that could serve as a multi-use structure.
The dedicated tower slated for this spot, alongside the emergency siren built to warn of tsunamis and other hazards, is slated for completion by next October and is expected to become a model for the nation, including a funding mechanism for more than $2 million from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, plus another $1 million from the tribe.
And this is our key manual on all the steps you need to take in order to build a tsunami vertical evacuation structure. And it has, community outreach, it's getting all of the technical partners together.
Maximilian Dixon is the Earthquake and Tsunami Program Manager for Washington Emergency Management. He's working with Professor Freitag on just how many structures are needed.
And so it's going to take a long time, and it's going to take a full effort from federal, state, local, tribal, all partners, and maybe even the private sector if possible.
The tower is built at the southern end of tribal property. It would also serve non-tribal members in the rest of Tokeland, which just starts a few feet to the south to the end of the peninsula.
We have resources, and we can be good neighbors to our people down here in Tokeland and North Cove, and that's our desire, and that's what we want to do.
It could take decades to build all those vertical evacuation towers, and that presumes the money will be there. So, are there any other options? Well, the Snohomish County Company has been working on that. It's been in development for a decade. It uses aerospace technology.
This can quite easily take 50,000 pounds.
Julian Sharp is an aerospace engineer. And after watching the horrors of the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, an event that claimed nearly 250,000 lives, he began designing a way to increase the odds of surviving one.
It's a system that allows you to evacuate immediately to a safe space, and then in that case ride the tsunami event out.
It was these pictures taken in Japan that really show what the capsule's designed for. Yes, people drown in tsunamis, but a big threat is being crushed to death in a swirl of floating debris.
2, 1.
This is an example of a drop test on the steel bolt. It didn't produce a penetration. The capsule was able to resist that.
and there's been a lot of interest, especially in Japan.
Nature is always testing us human beings.
It even survived a drop over Palouse Falls.
My 50-year career in doing tsunami research is that every time we discover something new, the hazard is worse than we thought.
Survival Capsule is working with Eddie Bernard, one of the world's top tsunami scientists.
Well, the 2011 Japanese tsunami is a good test case for the United States to sort of examine what could happen.
And with nearly 16,000 dead or still missing.
For every injured person, there were 3 dead people.
So how long does it take to get into a survival capsule? Well, I've got a stopwatch here. Let's go. So get one leg in, bring the other leg up, swing the door into position. Close it up, get in my seat, and that is 26 seconds, and I'm pretty clumsy.
All right, let me see if I can do this.
Jeannie Johnson purchased one of only 2 sold so far in the U.S.
Good girl.
She lives in Washington's low-lying Long Beach Peninsula, where a drive to safety may prove impractical, and there are no evacuation towers yet.
I'll take the marine key from inside the house, open the door, get in, get Trixie in, and anybody else that can fit, frankly, and then I'll have to lock the door, and I'll write it out.
The company is now beginning to work with manufacturers to get them mass-produced, and a 2-person capsule is only just one option.
This is the 10-person capsule. It's roughly 8 feet in diameter. It has 2 entry points.
From research in Japan, the people inside would sit facing each other.
We have a 16-person capsule. That is fundamentally for schools.
Vertical evacuation towers or capsules, it's not an either-or choice.
We're going to need multiple options to protect people, save their lives.
The state of Washington has been concerned for years about the ability of the state schools to withstand an earthquake. And if they don't withstand that earthquake, students would be at risk. A study that came out this year found a number of vulnerable schools. Now the state wants the money to retrofit and fix them. Drew Mickelson visits one school in particular.
Just the intricate details that are in the building, the glass that's here. I would say that this whole foyer area is one of the most special places that you'll see.
He sounds like a museum curator.
K1, 2, 3 are all at lunch or lunch recess.
But Andy Justice is principal at Centralia's Edison Elementary School, one of the oldest in the state.
It hasn't changed at all except our birthday sign that's still up.
They just celebrated their 100th birthday, and the building is showing its age.
The cracks in the bricks, though, and a couple missing pieces and holes.
For the past 2 years, the Department of Natural Resources has been looking for schools considered high risk of destruction in an earthquake, either based on location, when it was built, or how. The age and unreinforced masonry at Edison put it on the list.
You're always worried about what could happen. You have to. It's better to be prepared and not need it than to not be prepared and end up needing a plan.
We live in an active zone, so we don't fully understand the risk in a large seismic event.
State Superintendent Chris Rakedahl is going to ask lawmakers for $50 million in the next construction budget, or the capital budget, to update schools like Edison.
State geologists have identified and partnered with us to help us understand where those risks are greatest. There's a prioritized list. We want the legislature to build a separate category in the capital budget and then commit to it for decades so that we can just keep working through seismic retrofit.
This is a roster of like a boxing matchup that they had back when the schools had boxing growing up.
Edison's principal says they've done a good job preserving the history here, but without the state's help, the district doesn't have the estimated $3 to $5 million needed for earthquake upgrades.
We're always doing maintenance on our buildings and trying to get them up to grade, but where does the money come from?
So you're at home with the peace and quiet and all the comforts of home, not the place where you would usually think about an earthquake, but what if the shaking started right now? What would that be like? Here's Ted Land.
Because you never know an earthquake.
It can happen so quick.
man. It's really strong. You're pretty much helpless until the shaking stops.
The Big Shaker is a traveling simulator showing what it's like to ride out a magnitude 8.0 quake.
Was that strong?
Yeah, it was powerful.
That initial shock you get really wakes up a lot of people and wants them to get prepared.
Is that really what it would feel like?
That is really what it will feel like. It could be a little bit of a more rolling motion, but yes, that is a pretty accurate simulation.
Ready America, a disaster preparedness company, drives this simulator all up and down the West Coast in an ongoing effort to remind people to take the threat seriously and get ready.
An earthquake can happen just like that.
They partnered with the Seattle Office of Emergency Management for this event at Seattle World School.
What are you supposed to do in an earthquake?
Put your head and neck under the table and hold something.
The 3 steps you need to know are drop, cover, and hold on. So you want to get under a table, a desk, something sturdy, cover your head and your neck, and then hold on to whatever you're underneath until the shaking stops.
It's easy to not think about the threat when all is calm, but that could change in an instant.
Good job, you guys. You survived an 8.0 earthquake. Well done.
Are you prepared to tough it out for 2 weeks after an earthquake?
It's going to be very, very difficult to bring in the supplies and everything that people need to help them through this situation.
We'll tell you what you need to be self-sufficient until help arrives. That's coming up next. You're watching Earthquake, Disaster Foretold.
Aircraft in Seattle, we have a huge earthquake going on. The tower is collapsing. I say again, the tower is falling apart. Hang on, everybody.
That was SeaTac Air Traffic Controller Brian Schimpf telling people to hang on during the 2001 Nisqually earthquake. Nerve-wracking moments which remind us we live in an earthquake-prone region. We've been telling you about the history and science behind earthquakes here in the Northwest and how the big one is coming someday. But that someday could be today. Would you know what to do?
If you're inside and start to feel shaking, remember these 3 words: drop, cover, and hold. Get under something sturdy like this table here, and make sure you're away from any windows or bookcases, and don't forget your pets.
If you're out on the road, you need to slow down and pull over. Make sure you avoid overpasses and power poles, and then stay inside your vehicle until the earthquake stops.
What if you're walking around downtown, big buildings everywhere? The bottom line, you got to try to get indoors because there could be glass, brick, debris falling. You're safer off inside. Glenn.
When we talk about an earthquake or an earthquake and tsunami, we're talking about an event. But once the shaking stops and the water drains away, who will come to the rescue? I talked to the man leading the planning to look how the state will respond. What does it take to respond to the largest natural disaster expected for the United States?
We had a magnitude 9 earthquake.
In 2016, emergency operations centers from 62 Washington cities, counties, and tribes, 75 hospitals, along with the National Guard, conducted an elaborate drill, an exercise involving 23,000 people, aircraft, Navy ships, setting out to find out how well we could deal with the worst-case scenario from a magnitude 9 Cascadia earthquake and tsunami. This exercise even had a name, Cascadia Rising. Here's what they expected. Nearly 8,500 people killed in the initial earthquake and tsunami, more than 12,000 injured, more than 500,000 buildings destroyed or damaged. 1.25 million of us will need food and water. Add to that more than 750,000 pets. 410,000 people will require emergency shelter, a disaster expected to grow worse with time, especially in bad weather.
The chances are that you'll survive it. The challenge is surviving the aftermath.
As the head of the state's Emergency Management Division and as a former fighter pilot, Robert Ezell always has plans for contingencies and says you need to as well. Why? In a magnitude 9 disaster, the damage gets worse as you get closer to the fault. Roads suffering complete or severe damage. Ground transportation to the coast cut off. I-5 from north to south, roads experience severe to moderate damage. 30% of fire stations, nearly half of police stations destroyed. More than a third of hospitals rendered unusable. 45% of hospital capacity lost. And the exercise immediately blew up the idea that we as citizens only needed 3 days of food, water, and supplies.
It was kind of a no-brainer decision. We were sitting around doing one of our after-action meetings, and we looked at each other and go, we can't even wait to do a formal process. We need to change the messaging. We need to change it now. It's the right thing to do. And we did it.
Everybody in the state is urged to have 2 weeks of food, water, medication, and more on this list. This brochure has been distributed physically or downloaded by nearly 250,000 Washingtonians.
So it's going to be very, very difficult to bring in the supplies and everything that people need to help them through this situation because of the impacts to the infrastructure. Therefore, again, it goes back to individual and family preparedness.
In communities like Joyce and Clallam County, they've taken a community approach with containers full of survival supplies at the ready.
Got toilet paper, got diapers.
A trailer to provide clean drinking water.
You're going to have a lot of this in your house.
And instructions on how to camp in an intact space inside your home to maintain warmth. Events like this driven by the results of Cascadia Rising.
We live in a very hazard-prone part of the country, and therefore for whatever the hazard is, whether it's earthquakes, whether it's fire, flood, landslides, all of these things impact communities and can put people in a position where they have to take care of themselves for a while.
Now they're going to do it again. It too will have a name, CR 22, scheduled for the year 2022, and planning has begun. It's a drill that could be bigger than the first.
Communications, mass care and sheltering, public health and medical, transportation, and then energy. So looking at those basic areas, making sure that we've invested time in the planning, how we're going to work together at all levels of government to meet the needs in all of those areas, and then go back and test those plans to see how effective they have been.
How to get the lights back on, how to get our cars and trucks gassed up. Preparation takes time. We just can't see the clock.
You've got to balance the thinking that you might have time against the reality is that it could be tomorrow.
After the earthquake has happened, then what? Here are some other tips on what to do.
After the shaking is done, make sure you check on your neighbors, especially if they're elderly or disabled. They may need your help.
Don't make phone calls unless they're life-threatening. It's going to be preferred that you text because text will likely go through. You'll also want to set up an out-of-area contact so that your family and friends can check in with that person in case you get separated. And then you'll also want to set up times for you to check in.
Stay away from down power lines and be prepared for aftershocks.
So what do you need in your own home disaster preparedness kit? Well, you're about to meet a woman who literally wrote the book. Keely Chalmers with our sister station in Portland interviews Betsy Shand, and you'll find out what she has in her kit.
Here in the garage, I like to keep an emergency kit that I can take with me.
One look around Betsy Shand's Southwest Portland garage.
You notice this is on rollers?
And you'll see she is prepared.
I can pick it up and wheel it off.
Prepared to live without drinking water.
Gallons of water.
Electricity.
If you're gonna have a flashlight, you're gonna have some batteries.
Or even a roof over her head.
So if you've got your tent, don't forget to have the poles.
In the event of a natural disaster. That's because Shand is sort of an expert on being prepared. She co-authored 2 books on how to survive natural disasters. The first one came out in 1995, soon after the spring breakquake, which rattled not only homes and buildings in our area, but also a lot of nerves.
We sold out of Surviving Natural Disasters, the first book in 1995, in less than 2 months, nationwide.
So what does this preparedness expert say we should all do? Well, first, at least start on an emergency kit. Make it as easy as possible.
You can buy these one at a time whenever you go to the store.
Water is key. 1 gallon per person per day for 2 weeks. And of course, storable food.
This is a container of food.
Extra medicine, tools, sturdy shoes, all things to collect. And try to get some comfort items in there as well.
If you're going to have chicken breast with rib meat, you might want to have some wine.
Our Steve Bunin talks to Scott James. He's an author on emergency preparedness, and he lives on Bainbridge Island. And he runs a company called ReadyPod. And you'll see how a ReadyPod can help you shelter in place.
So tell me something that I need for 14 days that I wouldn't have after 3 days, but I need to get to that 2 weeks. What would be an example of something we could find in one of these?
Well, for instance, power. So remember, when the big earthquake happens, our cell phone towers go down, our power goes down. We don't have running water, and this is not a winter storm. This is not for a handful of days. This is weeks to months. And so, for instance, we include this handy little Garmin satellite device. Yeah.
All right. So what is this?
Love this thing. So that communicates with the satellite tower, not a cell tower. You can pair it with your smartphone to make texting easier, but this allows you to talk to those out-of-region contacts that we want everybody to have, to be able to say, I'm okay. There's tons of lists out there on the web. The ones that I like best are either a complete list, like what we've done here with ReadyPod, where you can buy it all in one click, or those 12-month lists where you're setting aside so much money out of your budget each month in order to generally stock up over the year.
Yeah.
Now, our Michelle Lee has been talking to experts about making a communication kit for your car.
So here's how to make a communications kit for your car. You're going to want cords and chargers, and then also a map in the event the GPS is down or you can't get to a power outlet. Also, map out your route home and to a meeting place, and then also map out a detour in the event that the main roads are inaccessible.
Your kids can be part of your preparedness plans too, and Michelle shows you a program at the Red Cross that involves children and simple household items.
You know, there is so much for kids to learn when it comes to getting prepared for an emergency, and the Red Cross has this thing called the Pillowcase Project, and we have Maggie Shepard with us. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, sure.
Well, tell us what this project is about.
So the Pillowcase Project is about teaching disaster preparedness to youth so that they can be prepared and confident in the situation where something happens that's really scary.
What do we want to put in the pillowcases?
So the pillowcases are for the kids to create sort of their own personal kit. You want the families to have a larger, bigger kit with more supplies for 7 to 14 days, but for the kids, the pillowcase is something where they can put a flashlight, a comfort item such as a book,
or like a stuffed animal. Okay.
Exactly. Flashlight, important papers, so if there's any like family pictures, things like that, just in case the kid gets lost.
Where do you think that they should store those?
We typically recommend under their bed, so somewhere that can be easily accessible in the case of a disaster. A lot of people put preparedness kits in their basements, but we actually think that putting that sort of in your kitchen pantry or sort of, you know, more accessible place like under the bed is the best place for kids. Yeah.
Okay, and I'm just wondering, how do we know that these work for kids? What have we seen?
Yeah, so the Pillowcase Project is based off of the Hurricane Katrina disaster, where kids were using their pillowcases to carry around their personal belongings. So this Pillowcase Project was born from that disaster, from it working. And so it's just a way for them to have their personal items sort of over their shoulder. And so we know from that this works.
If you need information about surviving a disaster, simply text the word disaster to 206-448-4545. In June, there were some emergency drills carried out around Seattle, and it was about how volunteers could help their neighbors through an earthquake. Kelly Greenberg shows you just how those drills could play out in real life.
This is where you want to come in the event of a disaster.
This isn't your typical Saturday in the park.
That the really urgent messages can jump the line. Yeah.
But Erica Harnett
Yeah.
and other volunteers are in West Seattle, preparing for something far from average.
Please tell people to bring their medicine bottles with them if they need refills. Their electronic record system is down now, so you got to pass the word to the other hubs.
The group is practicing for what they would do after a 6.7 magnitude earthquake and the possible tsunami that would follow.
So these are very real risks that we have to worry about being potentially happening at any moment. We can anticipate that we would need to be potentially on our own and support ourselves for at best 3 days, possibly up to 3 weeks.
So they're preparing for the worst.
We can say, okay, now we've got the people that we can send to help this person.
Which means activating more than a dozen of these hubs.
So this is a location for people to come to get information because they cannot get on the internet, because they cannot watch TV. So this provides reliable, accurate information in the event of a large-scale disaster.
This is an exercise, this is an exercise. We have your
The information gathered at the hubs is sent to the Emergency Operations Center in downtown Seattle. The center is communicating using ham radio. They're ensuring that if everything goes dark, there's a connection between volunteers like Erica and people who can help.
So we need to be able to best support ourselves during that time period.
Coming up next, 40 years of earthquakes in the Cascadia region.
Still not convinced? Consider this. Each dot, everything that looks like a camera flash on this map, is an earthquake, recorded in what we call Cascadia since 1979. 40 years, speed it up, and that big dot was the 2001 Nisqually quake. And in the end, this is what earthquake country looks like, as prepared by the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center. The threat from an earthquake in the Cascadia subduction zone is clear. And as it turns out, the new head of the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network at the University of Washington, who doubles as the state seismologist, is an expert in those kinds of earthquakes. His name is Harold Tobin, and as we close tonight, we sit down for an interview.
You know, we talk about having 3 different kinds of earthquake hazards in our region, but they're all linked fundamentally to the fact that we live on the edge of one plate and another plate is going beneath it. That's the subduction zone, right? The Pacific Ocean floor sliding underneath North America looked 30 miles straight down below our feet. That was the Pacific Ocean floor going back a few million years. That process is, you know, when the 2 plates are stuck together, that's our big one. That's the magnitude 9 potential earthquake. But that also leads to most of the stresses in the overriding plate, in the ground right below our feet, that produces the potential for both those deep subducted slab earthquakes, the ones we talk about as being 30, 40, 50 miles deep, and also the crustal earthquakes like the Seattle Fault, South Whidbey Fault. They're all linked up in the same system of stresses in the earth that are caused by these 2 plates moving together.
You spent a lot of time in Japan looking at this. Japan is a mirror image of us. Yeah. It's sort of the same thing, only reversed. Japan also seems to be a few steps ahead of us in a lot of this, sometimes many steps ahead of us. So as you spend time in Japan looking at what they've done, their systems, their protections, because they have a higher degree of frequency than we do, and you bring that back here as sort of the state seismologist, what do you think?
Yeah, well, Japan really shows us the way on these things. And I mean, it's not a surprise, right? They've had many more devastating events. So to Japan, earthquakes and tsunamis are their homeland security #1 issue, the way we think about maybe global terrorism or something in the US. They're willing to spend billions of dollars on it. What they've done, though, is shown that if we can put those instruments out offshore, you know, so that we wire up the offshore seafloor just the same way we've wired up the land, then we learn much, much more about what these faults are doing and how they're storing that stress. They're also doing a better job than we are right now of putting stations on the land as well and making more detailed measurements, more comprehensive measurements with both seismometers and GPS stations, right? The ones that measure small crustal movements. We've really got to study all of these systems in order to understand how subduction zones work in general. So Japan tells us stuff, Cascadia tells us other stuff, you know, Sumatra or Chile or Alaska. Each one of these is a different facet on understanding the underlying plate tectonics.
But of all those subduction zones, it's ours that has not gone off during essentially the lifetime of a reasonably well-seasoned adult.
Yeah, that's essentially correct. Of all the subduction zones around the world that we think could produce a very large earthquake, say high 8s to 9 scale earthquake and a tsunami of the size that would cross the ocean, Cascadia is the only one that has a significant length that hasn't produced that earthquake in historical time. Now, our history doesn't go back as far here as some parts of the world, but we just don't have that information except from the kind of sleuthing that's come out of, you know, the geology, the paleo, the ghost forests, the Native American stories and all of those things. The Cascadia subduction zone is like the dog that hasn't barked yet. You know, it's clearly locked and loaded. It clearly has the potential for a very large earthquake, and we just haven't seen one apparently for a little over 300 years.
So when people say, is it overdue?
Yeah.
What's your response to
Yeah,
that?
I really don't like using the word overdue, because we also know that earthquakes, first of all, don't happen just regularly spaced in time. You know, it doesn't have to be uniform. But secondly, that it looks like from the sort of the forensic geology, the paleoseismology, that it's every 300 to 600 years or so for these big events. It's been 300. So has it been an amount of time that means the earthquake could come tomorrow? Absolutely. But the earthquake could also come 200 years from now and not be a surprise either, meaning there's a similar probability on any given day. It sort of slowly grows as time goes by, but we don't know when it's going to happen.
And we'll be right back. Here's another reminder. If you want to learn more about preparing for a disaster, you can text disaster to 206-448-4545. I live here too, and this is our 2 weeks ready supply in our backyard, built with the help of this guidebook from Washington Emergency Management, and we're still adding to it. Here inside King TV, we have supplies in place to not only help those who are caught at work with everything from water to food to portable toilets, but to try and stay on the air and online for you. Hopefully, we've provided you with information and motivation to prepare. This is not the first time we've looked at this threat, and we promise it won't be the last. Good night.